All right, yeah, y'all got it. That was a happy scripture we just read, wasn't it? It almost reminds me of how throughout this whole selection, the Koheleth is comparing good with the bad and saying that we should embrace what appears to be bad from our perspective. And today's scripture, if you're wondering, is a little more folksy of a translation. That's from the Message from Eugene Peterson. So that's why it's a little more 21st century friendly to us. But Koheleth, in this scripture this morning, the author of Ecclesiastes, is saying that we should embrace what appears to be bad. For example, having a small bank account. That's seen as bad. But if having a fat one comes at the cost of your reputation, it's simply not worth it. And also, at a funeral, which in our worldview, bad. But you learn more from a funeral than you do from a feast, which is a good thing. Crying is better than laughing because it scours our heart. The way I interpret that means that it develops empathy in us. And that we also learn more from being rebuked than we do from hearing good things, which kind of goes against what we know now about positive and negative reinforcement. But either way, Koheleth says, life is hard, own that life is hard, and let's move on. So we will move on to our friend Henry Nouwen. So let's hear what Henry Nouwen has to say about celebrating life. And this is a little long, so just hold on. Henry writes, our culture is a working, hurrying, and worrying culture with many opportunities except for the opportunity to celebrate life. When we speak about celebration, we tend to rather easily bring to mind happy, pleasant, gay festivities, in which we can forget for a while the hardships of life and immerse ourselves in an atmosphere of music, dance, drinks, laughter, and a lot of cozy small talk. But celebration in the Christian sense has very little to do with this. Celebration is only possible through the deep realization that life and death are never found completely separate. Celebration can only really come about where fear and love, joy and sorrow, tears and smiles can exist together. Celebration is the acceptance of life in a constantly increasing awareness of its preciousness. And life is precious. Not only because it can be seen, touched, and tasted, but also because it can be gone one day. When we celebrate a wedding, we celebrate a union as well as a departure. When we celebrate death, we celebrate lost friendship as well as gained liberty. There can be tears after weddings and smiles after funerals. We can indeed make our sorrows as much as our joys a part of our celebration of life in the deep realization that life and death are not opponents, but do in fact kiss each other at every moment of our existence. When we are born, we become free to breathe on our own, but lose the safety of our mother's body. When we go to school, we are free to join a greater society, but lose that particular place in our family. When we marry, we find a new partner, but lose that special tie that we had with our parents. When we find work, we win our independence by making our own money, but lose the stimulation of teachers and fellow students. When we receive children, we discover a new world, but lose much of our freedom to move. When we have been able to celebrate life in all these decisive moments where gaining and losing, that is life and death, touch each other all the time. We will be able to celebrate our own dying, because we have learned from life that he who loses it can find it. I think I like how Henry Nouwen wrote that better than how Koheleth wrote in Ecclesiastes. But both are reminding us that even in our sorrows, even in the midst of what is seemingly not good, we can find joy to celebrate. In the stories of people's coming out to their families, people are shunned by their family because of their sexuality. And it's painful. But what is gained is people stepping into who God has created them to be, not who the world tells them to be. I've known several in the LGBTQ plus community who, when they come out to their families, they lose their family support. But what they gain was a new community of people who understood what they were going through and celebrated with them every year, not only their birthday, but their coming out day as well, which hangs in that balance of life and death. And I want to share a personal story today. A few years ago, I was struggling, and I mean struggling. Not well up here for a few years. I didn't have much emotion about a lot of things, sad things, happy things. They were all the same. It was all part of this existential dread that I had found myself living in. In my depression, every day was just another day on the march of life. No joy, no sadness, just a march. When one day I was sitting in my recliner, I got word that a kid I knew from back home, who was a camper of mine from church camp, attended my friend's church, and my friend was their youth pastor, that kid had taken their own life. As I sat in the living room crying, I had tears of deep sadness flowing, and they continued. But after a few minutes, I noticed that on one side of my eyes were the tears of sadness and deep sorrow, but out of the other side of my eyes were tears of joy. As I sat there almost bizarrely disgusted with myself, I felt this sense of relief. And as another great Christian voice from the 20th century, Thomas Merton, says, he describes something that I felt that moment. He says of his experience that it was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. I had been awoken from the dream that this life was just a march towards death. I had been awoken from the dream that this didn't matter. It was not tears of joy that someone I had known and loved had taken their own life, but rather the tears of joy were because for the first time in over a year I had felt an emotion. And not crying out of my own pity, but having an emotion for someone else. I hadn't felt that in a real long time. And what that did is it spurred in me that it was time for me to figure this out. Because I was awoken from that isolation brought on by depression. And I was reminded that I still have love left to give. In this moment, I experienced life and death kissing each other. It isn't that we should take joy in our sorrow or in other people's sorrow, because that's what life is. This life is a beautiful and bizarre dance where joy and sorrow, life and death move together in some kind of weird dance. Knowing that death and dying reminds us of our humanity. It reminds us of our finitude here on earth. It reminds us of our love for one another as we realize that we will miss those who go before us. But also, death leads to new life, and that is a celebration. And that is why we celebrate, and yes, celebrate Lent. It's why we have to celebrate, yes, celebrate Good Friday. Because Easter is meaningless if there isn't a Good Friday. Life everlasting is meaningless if we don't understand what mortality is. Life isn't life if it has no end. And just as we Chalice get ready to move, we can't celebrate moving if we don't know from where this celebration comes from. Well, it comes because we have said goodbye. And we're thankful for what has been, but we have to say yes to what is coming ahead for us next. Celebrating life, even in the bad times, does not mean we are taking joy in sorrow, taking joy in death, or in suffering. But rather that joy we find in suffering means that whatever is opposing or oppressing us, whatever is causing our suffering, it doesn't have the last word. It is taking joy even when injustices are all around. Because we know that the moral arc of the universe, the moral arc of God's creation, bends towards justice. And that is worth celebrating. Come on.